the one page. There are still a couple more, but this has the fill-in page within it. We're printing those. So if you took this home last week and you would like a corrected copy, raise your hand. We can get those out to you. But this is the handout for today that Linda will be, continuing the second part of our series for today. Thank you.
There you go.
All right. Last week, one of my credentials was left out. I was born in Amsterdam, New York. So that's near Canajoharie. Of the 10 churches that my father served in his entire ministry, 9 were in the East, and the other was Third Church in Holland, Michigan, for 9 years in his 40s. And other than that, he was in the Eastern churches. In those days, it was not unusual for ministers to move back and forth and be very familiar out east and here. How many of you see that and know that personally, that there is still a very strong connection? Were there any questions that you had from last week, since we had very little time for questions at that time? Or shall I go ahead and give you the precious PowerPoint? The first slaves were brought to Manhattan by Dutch pirates, not the Dutch West India Company directly, and not the States General, and not the Dutch people. I'm going to go rapidly. This image was created by Adrian van der Donck for his book published in 1655, and then recently, becomes the cover of the book, the reprinting of his A Description of New Netherland. A Description of New Netherland by Adrian van der Donck is a key book that has been retranslated and beautifully published in the recent past. All familiar with this image? Manhattan up to Wall Street. Wall Street is the end of civilization, basically. Wall Street was 12 feet high, and the timbers that they used were 18 inches thick. This would be an impression of what Dutch people of the upper class looked like at that time. And last week, we talked about the deal that Kilian van Rensselaer was offering to the farmers that he was hoping to attract. And we concluded, with a comment from George Borchterth, that only the patroon is going to get ahead on this plan. And it was the beginning of looking for sharecroppers and setting up that system where you will always load 16 tons, and what do you get? Another day older and deeper in debt. That was later in our youth. But the idea is the same. You never get ahead, you're always in debt to the boss. And the word boss is a Dutch word. So many people got off in Manhattan, took the free ride from Kilian van Rensselaer, and decided they could make a better deal by staying in Manhattan. This is a picture of Fort Orange after it was developed enough from being just an ordinary grungy trading post to actually having neat little villages and a huge wall to keep out the Indians. There were many images of New Netherland that were produced by the painters and by the Dutch West India Company to make it look like the Garden of Eden, the perfect place to go, another world that was pure and beautiful. Island at the Center of the World describes the story of the early settlement in terms we had never seen before, and with a new thesis, showing us that Adrian van der Donck was a hero of those early ages. He comes through like Thomas Jefferson, or like a little bit of Benjamin Franklin, always knowing how to understand every side of something, or like his great ability as a beautifully trained, golden-haired, newly trained lawyer from the University of Leiden. He comes over to the colony in 1641 when things are in a shambles. There's no organization, there's been a lot of trouble with the Indians, and the whole book outlines how New Netherland became the one and only Dutch colony that began as a trading post and really turned into a place because enough people came that were determined to make it a mirror of the villages and the rights that they had had in the Netherlands, not a military dictator, which is what the government was in New Netherland in the beginning, with each governor and the Dutch West India Company having a charter that covered everything. The Dutch West India Company was given a charter under which they could print money, raise an army, collect taxes, and they were responsible for the church, and they were responsible for the schools. And the Dutch West India Company chose all the ministers and supposedly paid them. How do you think that worked out when we have the fact that the colony as a whole was never in the black? Never was New Netherland in the black for the Dutch West India Company. It was a losing proposition. And the turn to the slave trade was introduced into that company during this time. The actual colony is not Eden, but Adrian van der Donk would have been an elder in a Reformed church, because in the Dutch Reformed Church in the colony, because of his position under Kilian van Rensselaer, because of his acceptance by Van Rensselaer, and because of the way he writes about the Indians. You see a Christian man applying the actual essence of the Christian faith to a people that are usually just treated as savages and not worth paying attention to. And yes, we're supposed to try to Christianize them, but it's hard to do that. And then when the wars break out, it's very savage indeed. Here's a picture of the Oudekerk in Amsterdam. It's a long way from the typical Reformed church in the colony. It was probably a Catholic church that was switched over to Protestant in the Reformation. Other glimpses of the stately Oudekerk in Amsterdam. The headquarters of the Dutch East India Company, they look like they think they're a worldwide company, and they really are. Your handout, the first 7 pages, are all part of the apologies that was published by the government of the Netherlands as their answer to the demand these days for countries to confess their role in the crimes of slavery. And so that whole thing of the first 7 pages gives you a lot of detail about how wealthy the Dutch West India Company was. For purposes of this class, it doesn't matter whether you say east or west. They were overlapped a little bit, and they eventually united. And they both were bankrupt by 1796. By 1796, the Dutch East India Company and West India Company were bankrupt, but the Reformed Church had survived. By 1800, there were 139 churches in the colony. And as Donald Brueging says, that was only by the grace of God, considering all of the shortage of ministers, the low quality of ministers they could even find sometimes who would want to come over here, and we'll go into that in just a minute. Of those 139 churches, there were like only 40 that had a minister, something like that. 40 ministers, and some of them were deposed for things like constant drunkenness, faking their credentials, bigamy, things just weren't going too well. And one complaint was that the sermons were too short. When the people in Schenectady were asked to contribute to the minister's salary, they said, well, he was only here for 15 minutes on Sunday, and we thought the sermon was just starting and it was over. We're not paying the guy for a sermon like that. So the sermons were too short. And the ministers were too involved with worldly amusements themselves, and other ministers were way too severe on worldly amusements. So you had both sides of people being dissatisfied with their ministers. And then, of course, the elders have the right to tell the minister it's time to take a hike. The elders could get rid of their minister, and they did. So one thing we have to realize as we read more about this is that the citizens did gain power that they had had back in the Netherlands, both in the church to exercise the power of those elders that are the core of authority in the church. The minister is really just one of the elders, and that they had to assert that. And then the people were able to force a city council on Stuyvesant in 1649 and start to restrain him and, have the people tell him what he can do. Here's the church at Sleepy Hollow, built by the Lord of the Manor, the patroon who had that at that time. Notice it doesn't say Reformed on the historical sign here. They took the Reformed out of there. But it was built by the patroon. My father served briefly the church at New Paltz. Here's the company that went bankrupt after doing things like this, wiping out an entire indigenous population that they didn't feel they could have any use for in order to introduce slaves into a colony. That didn't happen here, of course, but that's what they were capable of elsewhere, which is why I gave you the 7 pages of rundown on the full extent of the activity of the Dutch West India Company around the world in all of the places where they were fighting and establishing capitalism. This is a house in Queens, New York, that was used by Francis Doughty, who was a contrary thinker. He was an English Calvinist, and he was closely allied with Adrian van der Donck because he became his father-in-law. So van der Donck marries Mary Doughty, who is right in there with the English Protestants who are on Long Island, trying to put limits on the governors and on the powers of the Dutch West India Company. By this time, they really wanted to get rid of the Dutch West India Company. I'm going to skip this, except to say that van der Donck went all the way to the States General. Now, the States General is circumventing the Dutch West India Company to go all the way to the top and make your case that the colony is suffering because of their lousy governors and their complete lack of reasonable support for the church that should have been coming from there. And he's so effective, and he's done his work so well, and he's so good in the courtroom that he wins. And he wins his case, and they order Stuyvesant to come back to the Netherlands, and they're going to send van der Donck home now as president of the council that's now in the colony. But then a war breaks out before this happens. And all of a sudden, the States General's too afraid of what's happening in the war to go ahead with such a big change in the colony. So everything turns upside down, and now van der Donck's in jail, and Stuyvesant is reinstated. So he's trapped in the Netherlands, forbidden to come back to the colony. This is how brave he was. This is what he did to stand up for the rights of the people, which I'm emphasizing with respect to the Dutch Reformed Church and slavery, because most of the people you meet in Russell Shorto's book are allied with the Reformed Church in some way. Now, we're not trying to do Reformed Church jingoism here. We're trying to complete a confession that involves telling the whole story, the way it really was. But if you look through Shorto, he will help tell the story, even though he doesn't mention the Reformed Church itself very many times. He does think that Michaelius, the very first Reformed Church minister, is the nastiest man that ever came to Manhattan. He puts something like that. He just thinks the man is just a complete asocial, jerk. He couldn't get along with anyone. He'd been to 2 colonies before, and it's 1 year here, and 1 year here, and 1 year here. When you see that, you know something went wrong, several times over. So let's put him in the colony. And Michaelius did good work, and he's outlined in Donald Brooking's history, but Shorto doesn't think very much of him. Van der Donck had a long and useful relationship to Megapolensis. And reading between the lines, they both wrote extensively about the Indians. I'm going to pass around now for you to just look at. I have 3 copies of the description of New Netherlands, so you can see what it is. Give it the 1-minute thumb through, and you'll see what this book is, all by Adrian Vanderdonk. And the mark there is the beginning of his very long essay on Native Americans and what he says about them. And you will see exactly the type of enlightened person that you would like to see today, looking as an anthropologist with curiosity, with education. And you look at this and you say, this is the kind of leader we needed in the colony. This is the person we wanted in charge of our Indian relations from day one. But he did take journeys into the Indian Territory with Megapolensis. And although he says the Indians were very difficult to Christianize, and he explains why, with respect, with the kind of respect that an intelligent missionary would always have. At the end of his career, Megapolensis in Albany had baptized 329 Indians. And it wasn't just like sprinkling water on everybody and saying, you're a Christian now. There was much more to it, as you know there would be. Reformed elders and laity guided the orphan churches who arise and grow without clergy in many places. So it emphasizes that although it was not an advantage to have the elders in charge of the only getting the churches together, nevertheless, there was polity, or a plan, or your plan of governance established in the Reformed Church that would allow 25 people to start a church in an orderly way. Select some elders from among the people. The elders know what to do because they've come from that system in the Netherlands. It's not ideal, but elders were harboring churches. One reason is that by 1701, the literacy rate in the Netherlands was 85%, the highest in Europe. So this is being reflected in a high percentage of the lay people in the congregations being able to read. And so the church can be supported by the things that might typically be on their bookshelf in the homes of the settlers, not just in the minister's library. Fox's Book of Martyrs. How many know what that is, have ever even heard of it before? All right, it's the Protestant answer to the saints' lives that the Catholic Church would have held up as examples. And Fox's Book of Martyrs were all Protestants who gave their lives at the hand of some Catholic or monarch power. So it's a very Protestant kind of substitute. But it was moving because it was testimony about specific people and their lives. And then meditations and sermons and hymns. The Genevan Psalter has been produced in, I think, 1585 or something, and is the anchor of the Reformed churches all over Europe. And so these tunes and these melodies, if we look in our hymn book today, we'll find at least 16 hymns that are from the Genevan Psalter. So that was a support. They like almanacs, and you might find the Heidelberg Catechism, the Belgic Confession for Reformed churches, even in a home. And the amazing strides of the Dutch people in all aspects of scholarship in the Netherlands is not to be forgotten as a strength and a resource that was at the call of some of the educated people who wound up in the colony. Schools were established. There were some schools established. Today, the collegiate private high school in New York is very difficult to get into and very highly rated. It's still, the ultimate, like, Ivy League of Manhattan high school, started by Michaelius at the collegiate church. And Kingston had an academy, Alamy had an academy. As soon as the settlers had enough money and ability to organize an academy, they felt it was very important. There were routes up north already by this time that some slaves from the south could get away. It wasn't large yet, but there were routes that were bringing slaves who were running away from the south. By the time slaves are third generation, they've become fluent in English, and some of them can read and might be able to handle something like a catechism class or more full-bodied Sunday school, a school that, and don't forget that the Sunday schools were established in England about 1800 for street urchins. And at first, they were forbidden by the mainline churches. The mainline churches didn't want to have any part of taking the children out of worship. So Sunday school was if you had a Sunday school, you were an extremely progressive church, because the mainline churches didn't want to do Sunday school. But Sunday schools were forming among blacks themselves as they began to be able to do so. What happened? I'm sorry. I pushed the wrong thing. Reformed polity fits free people and fits diversity. I'm not going to stop to explain that, because I think, how many of you feel like you understand that? Reformed polity fits diverse people. Steve is nodding his head. It was going to be a big seller in the 1800s. The people who weren't necessarily part of the Reformed Church, once they decided that their services were going to be in English, which they didn't do till the late 1700s, it was the religious base that appealed most to the American people. What's so hard about the Heidelberg? How many of you agree that Heidelberg is not that hard for children between 8 and 10? How many of you ever studied the Heidelberg Catechism, and I mean really looked at it?
I did.
All right. How many of you had to memorize something? All right. Well, we've still got the Heidelberg is alive and well. So what does that mean? I timed myself, and everybody who writes about this thinks that the Calvinists were really just wrong-headed to impose all this doctrinal stuff on those poor children. Well, what does it take? How long does it take to say the alphabet and count to 10? 30 seconds. How long does it take to recite the Apostles' Creed? Also 30 seconds. So it takes the same amount of brain cells to say the Apostles' Creed as to do those simple things that everybody expects young people to do. Of course they have to be explained. They don't mean anything as rote learning, but what is the psychology of it? The Lord's Prayer takes 13 seconds. Sometimes we are underestimating what children can do. How many of you hated the Heidelberg Catechism when you had to study it? How many of you got engaged by acquiring at least some vocabulary and ideas and concepts that are more than Jesus loves me? They're more than Jesus loves me. They're more about the relationship between God and man, and how there can be a church, how there can be a faith that unites people. All right, so a few blacks are becoming free by various means all this time. Not if they ran away, they would stay in place somehow. They would stay close by. But there were many ways that they were freed other than that, which we'll go over in just a minute. By the time that the elimination of the foreign slave trade, now we're moving back after the American Revolution. As part of the Constitution, the slave trade would be, the foreign slave trade would end in 1808. So what did you have left? The domestic slave trade. So all the slaves on the auction block were homegrown. They were slaves that the Southerners were trading around, buying and selling. They didn't want all that competition in the market from foreign slaves. That's too much supply. They wanted to keep that price up. So you can see why some of those Southern senators were willing to agree that, yeah, 15 years from now we'll eliminate the foreign slave trade, because we're going to have a pretty good domestic trade going on. So we don't want to think that a terrible showdown was on the way. Music was extremely important, as we all know, not only the beautiful Genevan Psalter and the Bay Psalm book, its parallel in New England. Now, in 1850, as Mark Twain is writing Huckleberry Finn, he has him meet Calvin. A famous saying from Mark Twain that I like, Chaucer's gone, Shakespeare is dead, and I'm not feeling so well myself, he would say in his piece. So Mark Twain has Huckleberry Finn ponder what he's heard from Ms. Watson, but he doesn't have it completely right, so he tells Jim that it's about pre-4 or destination. I love that. This is the house that my husband John and I owned in New Jersey. New Jersey was phasing slavery out beginning in 1790 in phases. And so it depended on how old you were and when you were born. If you were born before 1788, you were a slave for life. But if you were born after 1788, you were going to be into this staged process where your age group would be freed. So this house was built in 1795. So George Washington was still alive, and slavery was still partially alive in New Jersey, but all the owners knew that their slaves were going to be freed. And so maybe out of human compassion, you would know you can't just set your slaves loose on the street with their little bag and say, here's a ham sandwich and good luck to you. You're going to have to prepare them to assimilate and acquire trades and be able to do something. So from the beginning, this was not only a house, but a post office. That side was a post office in Millstone, New Jersey, 1 block from the Dutch Reformed Church. It was one of the first 900 post offices in the United States, where the United States only had 900 post offices. Soon we're not going to have any post offices anymore because they're all going to be melded, and well, it was something else, maybe. But until 1895, this was a post office, and then it was continually some kind of store thereafter. Now, I'm bringing this into this because this building has both an attic and a cellar that are absolutely wonderful. The cellar has gorgeous stone walls, reminding you of some wonderful European wine cellar. It's beautiful. It had a wooden floor in the beginning, the records say, and it had a fireplace. And so you could make a fire in the basement. So I think that in the summer when it's cool, they lived in the lower level, and in the winter when it's cold, in the summer when it's hot, they'll live in the cellar. In the winter when it's warm, they'll go up to the attic, because there too, you had an entry right from the middle of the house here. There's a fairly firm door between the two parts, and when we bought the house, this was all nothing in particular. It was just 3 rooms. Another clue that it would have been people who worked in the post office, whether they were recently freed slaves on their way to something better, but still connected to the family, or whether they were still slaves that were being housed in the house, which most Dutch owners did, house the slaves in their houses, not a little shack in the woods. You couldn't do a shack in the woods in that climate. You'd have to have something better. And so I could see where this is a transitional house. There's no attic up here, but this is a beautiful attic where you can stand up. And it had one of those 18th century Dutch chimneys that has 2 chimneys downstairs feeding in this arch, all of brick, and then just 1 chimney going up through the roof. 2 reasons. Number 1, it saves heat if you only have 1 chimney instead of 2. And number 2, back in the Netherlands, you were taxed by the number of chimneys on your house. And so if you could find a way, you could legally sidestep your taxes by having one of these chimneys that would reduce it to just 1. So that was still in place. When we bought the house, that whole brickwork was still in place, beautiful brickwork. So this is a country in transition where not very many people were ready to confess in the Reformed Church that slavery was absolutely wrong in the eyes of God. And I started out by saying last week that I promised my son I wasn't going to whitewash anything. But I think that one of the things that we do as Christians today with this heritage is tell the story. and tell it correctly and look back at the history of who did tell the story correctly, who did get it down and admit what was really going on. So the two scholars that I depended on to learn about this were, first of all, Donald Brugink, who for his career was a church history professor at Western Seminary, and Gerald DeYoung, who wrote extensively about this project with a lifetime of study, not just a little bit of study that we can do in our situation. And the news is not good. Neither one of them would give the Reformed Church above a D-. And speaking truth to power. But in the sense that they did preserve a republic, as we just covered. They preserved a republic, and no society can eliminate slavery unless the people are in power. You're not going to eliminate slavery if the king wants slavery, or the military dictator wants slavery, or the company that owns the whole thing wants to promote slavery. But not enough ministers spoke out. Well, we just pointed out there weren't enough ministers, and that was problem number one. And number two, the ministers had more than one boss. They were directly hired by the patroon. The patroon, at a certain point, was getting 12 slaves along with the land that he was getting. Dutch West India Company couldn't sell the deal we talked about last week, so they threw in 12 slaves at the next stage. Now you have an excuse. I don't own these slaves. They were given to me with the deal that I came here on. I had to accept them. I don't have any workers otherwise, and I'll be nice to them. So now we have our favorite excuse. We have nice slavery here. And if you look down in South, that's where they have ugly slavery. They're beating their slaves up all the time, but here we're nice to our slaves. So I want to get from you a couple of our favorite dodges when it comes to slavery. What are our favorite stories that we like to tell? One is, don't look at me, look somewhere else. Another one is, we have nice slavery. What's another one?
Raise your hand and the mic will come to you.
How about the school of slavery? Slavery is good for them.
I can get there before you can.
It wasn't necessarily all bad because we Christianized some of the slaves.
Right. We have nice slavery is synonymous with we have Christian slavery because we're kind to our slaves. Some people said, oh, we're stealing the slaves from the Spaniards, and they're Catholics, and they treat their slaves terribly. So they are so lucky that our Dutch pirates picked them up at sea and brought them here and said, yay, we smashed Spain again. They're at war with Spain right now. And piracy is legal, by the way, on the sea at this time. You're entitled to take the contraband of your foe and bring it back to your port and sell it. So if you get a ship coming in that's got tobacco and some coffee and some rice and also 11 slaves, then the 11 slaves are just here. They were Spanish slaves. Now they're lucky enough to be owned by real Christians such as ourselves, not by the ugly Catholics. You have that excuse. I'm going to read you something Robert E. Lee said about slavery. It is often said that Lee defected to the Confederate cause, not from ideology support for slavery or secession, but from duty to his native Virginia. He acknowledged that slavery was a, quote, a moral and political evil, close quote, but he also exhibited a paternalistic form of racism that condoned it. Slavery, he claimed, was, quote, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. Blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing is necessary for the instruction as a race. This is the school of slavery here. and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. This is the sweet by and by excuse for slavery. We'll be all together in heaven. But just endure whatever God has. And God made slavery is another one. God made slavery. The Bible doesn't condemn slavery is another one. There's no condemnation for slavery in the Bible. So now, that is Robert E. Lee, and unfortunately there are many, many people in the Reformed Church who agree with everything he just said to this very day. And these kinds of cover-ups and explanations for slavery, yes, we had slavery, but, and then whatever comes along with that is probably an excuse. So, the important thing now as part of our work is to understand our past by making sure we find out what the story really is, pry away what was really going on. Now, Russell Shorto points out that within the last 15 years, there have been 12,000 pages of new primary material discovered on the East Coast that is written in 17th century Dutch, of course, so experts have to read it. But page by page, they're doing that. And we're finding out most of what is in there is for before 1638. Otherwise, our records disappear. And now we're going to be seeing more new stuff come out about the early years of all the religions and everything else during the formative years of the Middle Colonies. And we all know that the Middle Colonies keep getting forgotten. History's been written for the New England and Virginia, and New England and Virginia. And everybody forgets that there's a 200-mile stretch of the coastline that is the Middle Colonies that keep kind of disappearing from the records. However, as a New Jersey girl when I came to Hope College, and New Jersey again later in life, I have to say that George Washington fought more battles in New Jersey than any other state. So Massachusetts, stand back. And so what do we see developing? Well, hopefully it's something like maybe the compromise of the original builders of this house who built it in 1795 for the future. And with that, there was commerce, there were post offices, there was the wonderful new United States ready for tremendous growth in the 1800s. And what was the brunt of the 1800s then? To test the waters on slavery. And Ron last week tried to give you the highlights of how painful it was and all the steps that had to be taken in the Congress and in the culture to get from where they were at the time of the American Revolution to where they were at the time of the Civil War and after, when slavery finally came to an end with the Civil War. So what questions do you have?
I have one. Can you speak to Sojourner Truth, who grew up in slavery in the Hudson Valley and spoke Dutch before she spoke English?
That's right, yes. As I said, one of the churches my dad served was New Paltz, which was very close to the church that she would have gone to in her childhood, which was the Klein Esopus Low Dutch Reformed Church, Reformed Protestant. It had a big, long name on its sign, Klein Esopus. Esopus is the other name for Kingston. Klein Esopus, Low Dutch Reformed Protestant Church. Now, why did they put those things in that order? Well, they wanted to know Low Dutch. What does that mean? Well, Sojourner Truth's biographers seem to think it means ordinary Dutch. And it means the dialect of Dutch, I think, that would be called Low Dutch. It doesn't have anything to do with socioeconomic status. It would be common Dutch to send a message to all the Germans that were coming to that area. You can come here and you'll be able to understand something, because the step from Low Dutch to from German to Low Dutch is an easy step, or easier than many other things. And there she would have heard the hymns and the songs and the sermons, and she was taken to church. And it was not just until she was 5 or 6. It was longer than that. So I have looked into this. And her Reformed roots have not been sufficiently mined out, because the people who've written about her life, they think everybody who's an abolitionist is a Methodist. So they call them all Methodists. Olive Gilbert, who wrote her first, who wrote for Sojourner Truth, her narrative, was Methodist. So she kind of works backwards. But in truth, in that area, anti-slave people were networked together. They knew each other. And there were Quakers, big Quaker organization near Mohonk, at Mohonk Mountain House. Quakers, Germans, French, and many of the names are not Dutch at all. You have to realize the New Paltz Church was French. French Huguenots. So you had more French Huguenots than you can imagine. In the original, Michaelius gave his first sermon for French Huguenots, and Walloons, they're French-speaking. So it was already a diverse church in terms of which European countries were feeding into the population of New Netherland. And so that already was diverse for nations. So there's a lot that can be, like, for example, where did she get her idea of spontaneous prayer? That was, well, there's a long story there, but just reading prayers out of a book was not what the ministers were doing in those churches at that time.
My mic is coming.
Linda, you said that Don Brugink and the other scholar you mentioned gave the Reformed Church something like a D- in its treatment of
Yes.
slavery.
Yes.
As I listened to you describe what's his
Vanderdank.
Vanderdank's respect for the civil rights of Native Americans and other people of that era, and welcoming of runaway slaves and so forth, I thought I was hearing an A-. So where do you come down between?
Well, nobody had discovered Vanderdonk until Russell Shorto came up with Island at the Center of the World. He'd been completely overlooked and forgotten. And I cannot tell you which Reformed church he belonged to, but he and Megapolensis were the two officials that Kilian Van Rensselaer had put in charge, Vanderdonk of the Civic and Michaelius of the Church. And they were good friends, and they were colleagues for a long time, and they worked politically together. So there's no question that he's Reformed Church in spirit. If he happened to join the Episcopal Church, I would be flabbergasted. That did not happen. And if he happened not to be in a church, then why did he marry a minister's daughter? I mean, even Warren Buffett married a minister's daughter. So you can't go wrong, right? You can't not be in the church and marry the daughter of Francis Doughty. So there again, and her life was just beautiful when you read about it. So I want to claim them for the Reformed Church, even though at the time Brugink wrote what we're talking about, Adrian Vanderdonk had not yet been discovered by the work of Russell Shorto and so forth to really see who he was. But we're going to elevate him. He's going to go into Fox's Book of Martyrs when we rewrite that.
This question doesn't have to do directly with the Dutch Reformed Church and slavery, but I'd like to ask it anyway. It's been 150, 160 years since slavery ended in this country, since 1865. What are your thoughts about reparations? Should the sins of the fathers be visited on the children?
I don't really have any opinion on reparations. It depends on what it is, and I think that reparations is something that is going along with some of the requests for. It is more important for us to tell the story correctly and honestly than it is to go into money reparations, and I don't know how that would be done. To whom are you going to give reparations? How about my 4 grandchildren, 3 of whom had a black father. Let's get some reparations for my grandchildren, and there'll be many, 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 many versions of that as we try to decide what to do. But one thing you can do is not have Confederate generals reinstated as the names of United States military forts. Braxton Bragg was just reinstated as a general who, fought for the Confederacy. And now his name is back plastered over a really big military establishment. He's being honored. When U.C. Grant faced Braxton Bragg in one of the big battles, Bragg had to surrender. And under Bragg, his second man was James Longstreet, who was a well-known friend of his from West Point days. And so Bragg comes into Grant's tent. Longstreet comes into Grant's tent, and for just a moment they just reminisce about old days at West Point. And finally, Longstreet says, "You must be pretty proud to have bagged a general today, or with this remission." And Grant said, "He'd do our side more good if I gave him back to you." And they both laughed, because he's such a terrible general. He just didn't know what he was doing. He lost that battle and many more. He was the doofus. They're agreeing that Bragg is a doofus. So, okay, go ahead and put his name on a fort today. That'll be fine, but don't quote what Grant said about it. So that's something that shouldn't be happening. And now, how about this? At New Brunswick Seminary today, the students have taken down all of the pictures of all the old fathers. Kirkpatrick Chapel, this great big, late Victorian Gothic chapel on the campus of Rutgers University. And all the Reformed Church forefathers were on the wall. The students have taken them all down because they were slaveholders. We can't deny that they were slaveholders. So what is that? They're gone. Whatever they did that was good is lost because they were slaveholders. My sister-in-law and her husband ministered at Schuylerville. Philip Schuyler, a Revolutionary War hero, his monument, which was in the city square, was moved to the Schuyler estate because a monument to Schuyler can no longer be in a public place because he was a slaveholder. Well, he was a general in the Revolutionary War, but his statue can only be on his private estate now, not in the public square. So all over the country, reminders of slaveholders are being ripped off the walls and no longer made a hero. Is that the right thing to do? No, but it is right to tell the story correctly. Today, by the way, New Brunswick Seminary is 90% black student body. So the seminary that the Reformed Church founded is now serving the array of primarily black churches. And the president of New Brunswick Seminary is a very distinguished black leader. And so the Reformed Church did in various ways meet the Reconstruction, but then they do not get some kind of high grade from Brueging or from DeYoung. And I respect Brueging and DeYoung for staying away from the type of history that is constantly looking for ways to, again, exonerate your own tribe somehow. And that's not what it's about. So I also respect the Reformed Church so much for having the record of keeping their own history in detail. Look at the list of baptisms that you have in your handout. For a church in that time to sit down and write out this orderly form for every single baptism, the names and everything, so that we have these records. It's just amazing that the level of record keeping that they had. And is that an element of the institution of the church? Of course it is. We keep tremendous records in Hope Church, I think. They're all being digitized now, but up in the cloud if you don't keep those records, then you have no idea how to reconstruct things. So I think as this massive bundle of 12,000 new pages of history are sifted through, we will find out, we will see new scholarship that is very exciting and interesting in who's doing what and what really happened and how, where is the piece that the church either should have played, did play, or might have played.
Linda, you mentioned Shorto's book, Island at the Center of the World, which is a great read. Another one that I found fascinating is his book on Amsterdam,
Yes.
A History of the World's Most Liberal City. I think Ron Mulder recommended that
Yes,
in a
he did.
HASP class, but it is
And
also
I
a
haven't read
terrific
the
read.
Amsterdam book yet, but I'm eager to do that, because if you're going to talk about New Netherland, you should know more about Amsterdam. The other element here is the rhetoric that arose in the 1800s, primarily among Protestant ministers, were very strongly represented in the rhetoric that finally did win the hearts of the public over to the Civil War. And we don't have too much time left. In the Civil War, the summer that, at the point that Fort Sumter had been attacked, and Lincoln was calling for the troops. Did I mention this last time? As Lincoln was calling for troops, and now it was time to sign up, we're going to go to war. So overture was placed in General Synod. Do you support this or do you not? And the delegates reached a 2/3 majority supporting Lincoln. Now that has to be impressive because, as we might all know, Lincoln won the presidency with only 40% of the electorate voting for him. He had a 40% of the public when he won the presidency. But because the other side was all chopped up with several different opponents, we have Lincoln based on 40%. And as you know, in Congress, when they passed this rule about the 60%, to get a 2/3 majority really shows a great deal that they were ready to support a war in 1861. So that speaks to the laity. General Synod is, the delegates at General Synod are at least half laity and only half clergy. And so it shows support. And in the Revolutionary War as well, they were firmly patriots. Yes?
You mentioned in the handout that the RCA did not split over the Civil War as a number of other denominations did, the Methodists and Baptists, for example. And could that be because there were very few Reformed Church in America
That's exactly the reason.
in the southern states?
Yes, that is exactly the reason. The only states where there was any significant representation. The Reformed Church was only there in New York and New Jersey. And so they had no southern states. And so when the Civil War was over, it was over for members of the Reformed Church, except for everything that unfolded in the Reconstruction as to their attitudes as citizens and what would be voted for as the world adjusted. And we don't have time today to cover everything the Reformed Church did do to try to be meaningful with the recently freed slaves that came. That they did send some teachers and schools and establish some missions in the South. But of course, Yankees weren't very welcome in the South after the Civil War. So it was very difficult for more than northern missionaries or teachers to go down there. They would just be called carpetbaggers and spat upon and ridiculed and so forth. But no, the Reformed Church does not get a good grade from either Brookings or DeYoung. Yeah, DeYoung. And DeYoung gives a catalog of specific ministers owning specific slaves. That such and such a minister had his slave whipped at the post in Albany, and he was supposed to be branded as well. And instead of being branded on his cheek, they had him branded on his back. Was that supposed to be nicer or just less visible or what? What's going on there? But he doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't disguise what we do know about the deep involvement of ministers in all the colonies. In the foreign colonies, the Dutch West Indies ministers had whole plantations and were trading in whole groups of slaves. It was more common in New Netherland that it was 2 or 3 or 6 slaves. But it's still slavery. See, that's another excuse. Oh, I only had 6 slaves. I wasn't really into really horrible slavery. Yes, you were. So publications like, I want to point out that some of the most significant publications were the work of Frederick Douglass. He was the #1 black leader of the 1800s. Very well known by even 1850, and an unbelievably effective orator and writer. To me, he was the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass was the favorite reading of my students in taking a survey of American literature. Absolutely their favorite, because they could connect with it. And he wrote his biography 4 times as time went on.
Could we get one more question in
Yeah.
before we end?
I remember about 30 years ago, it had to be in the mid-90s maybe, going through the World Trade Center. We were on the bottom floor and past a ballroom that said New Amsterdam Room, N-I-E-U-W, the Dutch word for
Yeah.
new, which is the prefix of Noesma. And it sure made me feel at home.
All right.
And then 9/11 came along and the ballroom got crushed, and that's kind of symbolic of what happened to the Dutch in New York City.
Yeah. Well, anything that comes out of Washington Irving is pretty much misleading if taken as fact.
Thank you, Linda.
All right.
Most informative. I can tell you, when we were at New Brunswick Seminary, Larry was a student there, we were assigned to the First Reformed Church of Pompton Plains, which was a large congregation at the time. And Donner Atwood, some of you may know, recognize the name of Donner Atwood. He was president of General Synod at one time, and wonderful preacher, wonderful man. But they lived in the parsonage next door, very old, and they gave us a tour because upstairs there were quarters for enslaved people in the parsonage. And Donner was quite open about it, and of course, it was like, whoa, with the stairs that came, they showed us the door that you wouldn't have known was really there, the stairs that came from upstairs down to the kitchen, so that individuals could come down privately that way in the parsonage. So it was kind of a shock. And a good reality check. I can say it's interesting for me to note that when we tour in the South, particularly when we were in Savannah and Charleston, one of the largest ports where enslaved people came through, the docets constantly emphasize that we use the term enslaved people. We do not use the word slave anymore. We always say enslaved people, because I have my notes in the back, but one is because to stress the humanity. We are talking human beings. So we use that terminology. And secondly, it's about action and agency. That this was an action. It's not about a social status. It's an action that held human beings in bondage. And they emphasize that in their speeches again and again. And I so appreciated that. And they also use the term enslaver. Not a slaveholder, but they say an enslaver, again, emphasizing the action of human beings that they did.
And
So thank you very
Yes.
much.
on that last note, this is an adult audience, and we understand that when we use the term slave, we are not demeaning the person we're referring to. And I do see that in the educational institution, the teachers and the sociologists are asking that every reference to enslaved people use the phrase enslaved people. I have mixed feelings about that as a teacher as to how practical it is, but I understand what's behind it for the educators and in educating material.
which we hope those materials stay within our public schools. But that's another question. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Linda. As you recognize, today is Pizza Sunday. You've noticed all the chairs and you've noticed all the tables, I'm sure. So those of you who are able, it would be great if you could make 3 rows of 5 tables each with 8 chairs around each table. 3 rows, 5 tables each, 8 chairs around each table. Thank you.